Okay. Um, Alrighty. Well, happy Friday once again, folks. Um, I'll just be getting us started with the agenda for today's governance call. Um, for today, the couple things just to raise. And again, apologies if this was already discussed in one of the prior ones, but just some changes in terms of housekeeping, I guess, on how the recordings for the various baseline meetings are going to be stored. So I think from a recording perspective, the YouTube playlist is still going to be the go-to. But my understanding is that the OwnCloud account is no longer going to be the main place to go for the PowerPoint decks. So what Sheridan and I have started doing is adding those decks where applicable into a new dedicated location on the um, pardon me, on the InfoCentral site. So actually within the Fire Implementers community, there's now a dedicated zone for CA baseline materials for governance and profile reviews. I know it's on the slide, but I will put it in the chat as well. And again, like it's on the forum where any of these notes would be, so shouldn't be too hard to navigate to. With that in mind, the items that I know Sheridan had flagged for things to prioritize for discussion today are to start off, namely going into discussing how the group would want to address potential changes that come out of the review of the CA core, and then time permitting, looking at the stub value set approach. So some of these things I will rely primarily on the group's sort of background and experience for this. I'll certainly be note taking and flagging any sort of main items for takeaway. But again, I'm coming back to this after quite a bit of time away. So fundamentally, the topic that was sort of front and center for today's session was this question of how and when to address items for baseline uncovered through various review processes. So recognizing that the review that this group had done for CA core, the draft version 0.1, number of different constraints being identified, and that this was a community-wide review, but that may not happen for every other release. So with that in mind, the discussion question that's raised is for finding these differences in the future, what would the process be? And again, the only other thing I'll just sort of give some voiceover to is, that they're right. So, for example, for example, for version 0.2 of the CA core, if there isn't a full formal community review, like for 0.1, what would our process be there? What would some of the different things to have to consider be? So just I'll pause there. If anyone on the line has any particular perspectives on that as far as how we could follow. I guess in subsequent sort of a more specific question would be, does the group feel that a full community review is required for every release of CA core?
It's probably not a bad idea to go back and review that.
Some of it may depend upon the scope of the release.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we could review what's there, and then going forward, you only need to review if things change, right?
Yes, although right now, because we're in the process of adding cardinality and value sets, we may need to do a complete review for those pieces that get added.
Yeah.
And okay, thanks very much, both of you, Joni and Lorraine, for that. So maybe a follow-up question, and I do apologize if this is very this is pretty elementary again, just coming back from a little while, but with the CA core as it gets released, is there any sort of flagging of sort of like what the deltas are? That sort of helps like expedite that process of sort of helping target where like what things to look at.
I don't know.
Okay.
Like other than the releases, the CA core stuff has been fairly opaque to this group. So I don't know, and this we've only had one, so I don't know if how they're going to flag
Fair enough.
any changes or updates.
Understood. Okay. Something I can document then to say maybe it's so not sure if the CA core releases are going to continue to come with a change log or some kind of a way of identifying that, because that could also help the group figure out what's a better, like what's the best approach is if you know, maybe it's more feasible to do it for every release if there's a defined sort of short list of changes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. Okay, and for this one then I think because I'm getting the sense it's sort of it's a bit tough to know without knowing how the CA core releases are going to come to us. In that respect, given that only one has really happened, but it sounds like overall not a bad idea to conduct some level of review each time. But with that in mind, um, in terms of lessons, any kind of like lessons learned or anything like that from the first review of the CA core, has that been something that's been discussed already in terms of like what like if there was a next sort of community review, like how like um like what would we do the same, what would you do differently? Is that anything that folks want to share, or has that been discussed in prior calls?
I don't think this group has done that.
And is that Elliot?
Yeah.
No. Okay, awesome, Elliot. So if it hasn't really been something that folks have touched on yet, anyone who's participated in that community review have any feedback or anything just for me slash us by extension to keep in mind in terms of, you know, if and when there's a next review, whether it's the community wide review or just in any kind of case, like you know, what went well, what would any suggestions on what the group would do differently?
It takes more time than you think.
But that's true of all of these processes.
Yeah. Well,
I guess one of the things just to keep in mind is that as we do the review, we may, and we did this last time, find, as we would say in HL7 parlance, found items that may imply changes in the baseline, in addition to suggesting changes in the core. So it sort of goes both ways, particularly if we want the core to remain a true, truly conformant to the baseline.
and so, Lorraine, with that in mind, that's to say that as the CA baseline group might be conducting a review and seeing what might need to be changed or relaxed, for example, in the baseline, it could actually trigger feedback to go back in the opposite direction to sort of almost like counter feedback in the sense of, you know, if this is going to be one of the changes and this is the impact on us, like the CA baseline group has this feedback that the CA core group might want to take into consideration. Just wanted to check if I'm documenting that right.
Yeah, I mean, it goes both directions. So we found a few items, actually we handled one or two of them last week that came out of our review of CA core for changes on the baseline. That may happen less as we go forward and try to do more coordination between the two, but Elliot, you did a bunch of the scribing and documentation. Is there anything there we could have done to make your life easier?
Not really with the amount of effort I expect people here to put in. That is, I don't think most people will go away with homework or will take homework.
Yeah.
So we've only got that 1 hour a week. So I don't know that, other than sort of people getting more familiar with the process and how we want to phrase feedback or frame things, I don't think that there's much that could have changed there. Like, we couldn't ask people to go away, review patient, and come back with their list of changes, compile that list of changes, and then go through them one by one and go, yes, we agree with this, we'll put it into this group's feedback. No, we, as a group, we disagree with this one, we're not going to put it in the group's feedback. I mean, that's the only thing that I could really think of that might speed things up. But I don't think that's a reasonable expectation of this group.
Thanks for mentioning that, Elliot. Just taking this stuff down, bear with me. Okay. Right. Okay. So with all of this in mind, again, these were sort of the main like structured items that we wanted to look at. I guess really kind of the last one of sort of these sub points to just see if anyone has any perspectives on is, if we decide not to do the same type of community review for like CA Core like 0.2, any thoughts on sort of what would be the alternative approach? Would it be more ad hoc, like yeah, just and again, like it's not really about necessarily deciding that if folks aren't sure what the best approach is, or I guess yeah, fundamentally is there a better alternative, or I guess for when 0.2 comes down the pipe, is there a general sentiment that a community-wide review would be would it would be worth it to continue the process that was set for 0.1?
I'd say I think it was worthwhile. I mean, it gave the chance for everybody to, how to say, come to consensus on things before it got submitted up. So at least there was better understanding across.
Yeah, particularly while we're going through sort of the fundamental groundwork and changes on this material. I don't know if there's another way to make sure we get broad review from this community on something like CA Core.
And maybe just even considering what Elliot had mentioned, if it doesn't feel realistic for the expectation to be for any sort of like takeaway work, maybe the community, and this is just my, like, again, probably the most outside perspective, but maybe the community review approach is helpful. Just, taking that 1 hour, like that's when it's reliable, people are there, they're present. And to Randy's point, it reaches a wide enough amount of people. And even, the duration, I think it was Elliot, you mentioned that it takes longer than one might think. Maybe that's also in an unintended way, it allows more people to be more engaged, throughout the process too. So just throw that thought there. Okay.
Yeah, and as somebody who kind of joined the group more recently, it also provided a good level set. It was like, well, these are the discussions that people have been having. So I found that very useful. So I appreciate that too.
Great. Thanks, Pierce.
I think one of the things we could do better is in the wrap up in terms of the reconciliation part. I think we got a summary here of what happened in terms of the reconciliation discussions. But like the original meeting suggested we were going to do literally ballot reconciliation in the subject line of the meeting, but that's not what we did. We did a summary of reconciliation and proposed dispositions that had happened in another venue. So I think figuring out what the best way to do the reconciliation is on CA Core is one of the current unknowns.
Thank you.
Yeah, CA Core continues to walk this line between being a open consensus standard and a proprietary effort.
Yeah, and if we want to get to open consensus standard, we'll eventually have to sort of engage through HL7 Canada and figure out how we do that. And that's still forming. It's not solidified yet.
And Lorraine, not sure if that's is that something that is planned, or more of just like that's like, to your point, that that's just sort of the path they would need to take.
Well, there's discussions going on to that effect. Because frankly, the only way something becomes an official HL7 standard is if it's endorsed by either an affiliate or HL7 International. So a lot of this material still, from the standards point of view, still proprietary material. Not that it's not valuable, but it's not been fully gone through the standardization process. So I know that there's talks going on about how to do that. It's just not settled yet.
Okay, understood. Okay. Okay. Well, I mean, writ large, I think this has been I think good to hear from those who've shared, just in terms of how they found overall the that initial community review to go, and that it feels like it's worth keeping that approach in mind for whenever that next release or set of changes happen, that this is a good model to emulate for a few different reasons.
Yeah, they should be
Arthur-
coming soon, because we had the notice to the forum that CA Core version 0.2 was coming. Probably now it's within a matter of weeks.
Okay.
Because the notice came out before we even finished talking about the reconciliation.
Okay. So this will be very timely.
Yeah.
Okay, so well, and that's good to know. So outside of this sort of the general feedback, lessons learned, any other like points of either concern or discussion that anyone wanted to raise on just sort of, what parts of the previous process, the community review process, to carry forth into the next one? Any other ones beyond what you see on the slide here? Any other points anyone wanted to just raise? Okay. All right. Okay, so the other item we had, and again, I as always with these, I won't hold anyone up here if we feel like we've sort of gone through the majority of these discussion items, and certainly, folks, of course, as we're going through these, if you feel like these are important discussions, but there's just, whether it's me just not having the depth to engage on it, or other factors, if you think that there are things that need to be discussed, but it needs to be done in a different forum, that's also very helpful for me to document. so don't hesitate to mention that. But our second item that we had on the agenda was around stub value sets. So this was an item where people would be selecting the value set directly without going into Terminology Gateway. Context being that Alberta has raised that they're using practitioner and practitioner role until the CA core profiles are further stabilized. But that there's some terminology in the provider, I think PR would be provider registry, sorry if I'm correct there, that still doesn't have a stub value set, some do. So the main point of discussion here would be, should we be making that the stub value set approach like the main approach for any terminology that we're referencing in CA baseline?
When we're creating stub value sets, what are we putting in them? Is it just a subset of the actual values, or is it a specific expansion as of a certain date, or what's in there?
I think they are empty. Is it value sets or is it code systems?
Well, this says value sets, but
Yeah.
because if they're empty, it doesn't necessarily help our IGs in terms of resolving terminology and getting rid of warnings if they're empty sets.
And I can just confirm from a technical thing like that, the idea is that it's talking about value sets. It's not referenced as code sets anywhere in the agenda or the item that was flagged for today's. So I think value is the intended type.
So the value of them right now, if they're empty sets, is just so that we don't get basically you don't have a 403 error when you click on them. Is that what the value they're giving us? I haven't used this, so I'm trying to figure out exactly why and where we're going.
Yeah, so some of my experience, and it was more with the code systems than the value sets, is that we know, for example, immunizations. There is a code system maintained by Can Immunize for immunizations, but it's not exposed anywhere as a FHIR value or as a FHIR code system. And so we want to say, use these values, use these concepts, and but we don't have the right to publish that list because it's Can Immunize's list, and they don't make it available. So how do you record that intent?
Yeah, and there's
When you're
international
saying Can Immunize, are you talking like the Canadian vaccine catalog?
Yeah,
Which-
very possibly. I'm just going off of memory here.
Which has just been replaced with the National Vaccine Catalog. And we are going to be, Hi is going to be recommending National Vaccine Catalog. We're just working with InfoWay to figure out how it gets recommended, if it's going to be in Terminology Gateway or whatnot.
Right. So I'm just going off of, 3-year-old discussions. And when Sheridan and I were working on IPS and doing some of the other work with CA core, or CA baseline, rather, this was one of our challenges, is how do we point at value sets that or code systems that we know exist. But they just aren't being exposed by their publisher or by Infoway as a fire resource.
Yeah. HL7 International hit the same thing, particularly within some of the stuff that comes into the financial management space. And I did sit in on some sessions where they went back and forth about explaining exactly how to manage and how to do this. So for that particular problem where there's we don't have anything we can point to, there's probably in the last 3 years had been some guidance developed. The other piece I'm thinking of, and this may be somewhat related to what Alberta raised, is, for instance, we bind to the practitioner role codes in the terminology gateway for practitionerrole.code. But of course, if you're trying to validate that or link to it from an implementation guide, it doesn't come unless you've got something that comes back without being logged into the terminology gateway first. There's a challenge both in the validation in the IG and in retrieving the codes at runtime. So I don't know if the stub value set solves that problem, depending on what's in it.
No, I don't think it does.
Yeah. Because there's a significant number of codes of value sets that are published in Terminology Gateway that we do want to bind to and use. I actually think I need more information about what we're actually doing and what we're sending back with stub value sets to really answer the question in the third bullet.
Okay, understood.
I know others may have used it more directly and have more knowledge, but
Randy, do you have more details on the issue that's being discussed or that was raised?
Not sure, but what I think was raised is because when you look at the IGs and you click on some of those stuff to go look at it, a bunch of the links show up as broken or whatever, that you don't see anything because you're not logged into the terminology gateway. And so the intent was to make it so at least when you click those links, you got something meaningful rather than a you don't have access kind of error.
I think that
Well-
might be partly because a lot of the value sets are based on SNOMED, and by having an account and logging in, you're agreeing to SNOMED's licensing agreement.
yeah, but this problem occurs even for stuff that's not SNOMED. It's
Yeah.
material
you're
that
not-
came, or actually a lot of it came from the original master terminology worksheet in V3. Practitioner role codes are one of the examples of that.
So basically the desire is to make it so that we have a user-friendly result without having to be logged in. Now,
Yeah, and it's sort of comes into how we're managing what we're doing as we stand up jurisdictional terminology servers relative to what Infoway's planning to do with the terminology server, which I understand is on the roadmap, but I don't know where it's at.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if it's an actual Fire server or if it's just Fire compliant. I'm not sure.
Well, I don't actually think that matters.
No? Okay.
If it serves up
Mm.
JSON value set representation, I don't think it matters, how we created it.
Yes, if it can provide the resources, the fire resources at that endpoint, then yes, we should be okay, or at least for a certain set of problems. On the other hand, if it doesn't serve up fire resources, then you're still going to run into a different set of issues.
Mhm. But it seems to me that the stub values that approach however exactly it's set up is a workaround until there is a terminology server. Is that a correct assumption?
I don't know. I think part of that depends on whether whoever stands up those terminology servers has the right to distribute the terminology that's being referenced.
Yeah, but I mean, I was talking about even as we wait for an InfoWay one, right? And what's the distribution rights on the material that was InfoWay specific that's in Terminology Gateway? And also governance questions coming out of this question, even without answering your point 3, Michael.
No, for sure. Well, and then of course, folks, I wish I had more. I wish I could contribute more on this, but it's interesting hearing though. I mean, as folks are talking about, I'm just thinking back to my EMR days, but it does sound kind of like the value here would be, yeah, if for whatever reason an implementer can't actually access the gateway to get those value sets, that this is a way of still presenting them so that that's not a barrier, to your point, Larry, maybe a bit of a workaround. I guess, would it be fair to say that there's an inherent challenge there in that it would then behoove us to ensure that those stub value sets are manually like updated to make sure they're consistent with what's in the terminology gateway, like for those values, if there's any changes?
Yeah, I don't know what, in order to answer that question, I'd have to know what's in the stub value sets and how they're created.
Okay.
I mean, some of these questions are coming up. I was in a meeting actually just yesterday on requirements for a terminology server jurisdictionally. So, because actually most of the jurisdictions do have jurisdiction specific terminology, like for instance, in the provider registry space, you know, in the V3 material, BC enhanced and extended the value sets that were in the terminology gateway. So they have a need to distribute, you know, their version of the BC specific value sets, for instance. So I suspect lots of jurisdictions are going to be coming up against some of these questions. But if we want to make sure that people are referencing the Canadian material and referencing the Canadian baseline, I think we need to make sure all of this is clear.
There's also a technical challenge around the fact that the IG publisher support for alternate terminology servers isn't quite there, I don't think. I'm not sure about that. It's improving, yeah. And I know Graham has some grand plans around this, is how you know, the jurisdictional terminology servers are going to be stood up.
Yeah.
But I don't know that we're at a point yet where something like that is feasible.
Yeah. So I've been assured that, for instance, we in BC around provider registry, they've developed a small, not small in terms of necessary in terms of code, but you know, just the bare minimum functionality for pulling the BC terminology, serving up the BC terminology that's used in provider registry. And that once that's in production, which is close, Jean's assured me that we should be able to reference that from the IG publisher so that all of those code references actually resolve when we get rid of the 700 warnings we currently got in RIG where it can't resolve the terminology. I don't yet know if that's true because we haven't tried it yet.
Okay, that would be great if that actually does work.
Yeah, it's being advertised as working. But you're right that part of the infrastructure has been evolving and is not necessarily mature yet.
I think it will be ideal if it can be done in Canada Infoway, but yes, I completely agree. That's what we said, and we had discussion in BC as using me pretty well. And yesterday's meeting, we did explore the came with awareness to all the different groups in BC that we're looking or to explore terminology gateway or terminology server for BC, or can Canada Infoway, can we host it there, or how things should be working? Yes. Thank you.
Mukesh, you cut out a little bit there, at least on my end. Did we hear you correct that what you were just noting was that in some recent conversations, at the BC level, there's just discussions about the jurisdictional terminology server?
Yes, so in fact, as Louis mentioned, yes, I said it will be ideal if we have something at Canada Health Infoway platform for each jurisdiction, but definitely there will be a challenge. So we are exploring at this point for BC if we have our own jurisdictional terminology gateway somewhere where we can put our various value sets. We already have some of them. We are publishing through our website, which is just publishing, but it is, if we want to use through the system, definitely we need some server where we can host all the value sets beside health registries project to work, as Lorraine mentioned, which is going very soon into one of the terminology gateway for them, those projects.
To summarize, and Mukesh, correct me if I've got it wrong. The discussion was originally, it started with how do we host and publish the BC specific value sets and some of the terminology authoring requirements. We're still at a requirement stage.
Correct.
And then one of the open questions and the requirements is how do we connect with value sets that are published externally, like in Terminology Gateway, and how do we coordinate with any upcoming Infoway terminology server in terms of maintenance and publishing. So those were still open questions.
Correct.
Have I got what you were trying to say correct?
Yes, you are completely correct, Lorraine, yes. And I see it might be a challenge if EMRs comes into the picture, means the access and sensing and all those things. We might need to consider those pieces as well.
Okay, thanks, Mukesh, Lorraine. Okay. So again, I'm just summarizing. So I know that a little bit of this, I think, is just a bit of a need for a bit more context sort of around how exactly these stub values are set up. But I think we also are sort of capturing a bit of a broader governance conversation around jurisdictional and jurisdictional terminology servers, and sort of how these fit together. Recognizing that, I guess some of the feedback has been wanting to, just have a bit more context on this, but any other sort of just things that folks want us to consider, or just any takeaways, any things for me and Sheridan to sort of take away for this topic? Alrighty, well,
I was just
go ahead.
pausing. But I think the main thing is to come back to this group with a bit more detail on what's been implemented relative to stub value sets.
Yeah. typing. Okay, thank you, Larry. Okay, awesome. Just looking at the time, about 1:45. So we got through the two main items. I think what I had checked with Sheridan on, just in terms of some of these other topics now that the series has resumed after the community review. The main things that I've got down that have already been tackled are in green. The ones in blue are to be deferred until a bit later. I know we've kind of tackled this second one here about how we'd like to address potential changes. But maybe just wanting to double check and just with some of the time remaining, can go through the ones that are in black here to ensure. I know from the top of the hour, we talked about how to run those reviews and everything going forward. But in terms of identifying how we would want to address the potential changes that came out of the CA4 review, is that anything that folks feel have, like, if it hasn't already been discussed in different calls, does anyone have any particular thoughts on what it would look like to address those changes that came out? And also, just sorry, subsequently, I'll call out that if folks don't feel like they have anything necessarily to say on that topic, the other ones, because again, we've already looked at the stub value approach just a moment ago. There is this topic as well, reconnecting to current state with roadmap diagram and prior questions. Also returning to discussion of must support obligations as a baseline spec. And then what is the baseline group scope in relation to the CA4? So these are all topics for the resumed series, not necessarily have to be today, certainly not. But yeah, I just wanted to make some space, given that I think we've sort of rinsed through the first two main topics, if any of the ones in black stand out to anyone. And for that matter, if you don't have a specific perspective on it today, but you feel like it would be a good topic to prioritize for the next governance call, that'd also be good to know.
So our next governance call is on the 10th. And then the one after that would be in the middle of the HL7 meeting. Or right at the end of it, to be more precise.
Yeah, I can flag that as well. Right? Next call would be on the 10th. And then after that, after the 10th, it would be the 24th. So it's the May 24th. That would be right at the end of the HL7 working group.
Yeah, the working group meeting is the 17th to the 20th. Well, the 18th for the Connectathon to the 24th.
Okay. Ready. Okay, well, folks,
So we had,
sorry.
I had promised to do a little talk on use of metadata profile and some of the pros and cons with profiling the use of metadata profile. So I don't know whether we want to do that on the governance call or whether we do that on the technical call. So that could be an upcoming item. The other one, and this is biting off a huge thing potentially. Lorraine, you've mentioned several times about actually putting in place, formalizing what our governance is. And, you know, what decisions need votes and who has voting privileges or whatever within this group. I don't know if that's something that we say we should document here, or whether we say, well, CA baseline is a working group of HL7 Canada, and it inherits HL7 Canada's governance rules, so decision-making processes, and then we can go have that discussion at HL7 Canada.
Yeah, I mean, it's also related to the, overall governance that InfoWays proposed on their roadmap and how we fit into that relative to us and CA courts here. So all those things are interrelated. And we might want to look at what's in our control and what isn't, just so we can then, say, this is how we're going forward. And, as we get more information, we can fit into the processes that are above our heads. But as you suggest, waiting until those things are all clear might not be practical.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be nice to have, that one black bullet that's right after community issue items. To know what the environment is that we're living in. And that would make it easier for us to deal with what you just suggested. I think it's important. And the pieces that are HL7 Canada's are important. And actually, I wasn't on the last HL7 Canada meeting because I had a conflict. But those, as those things come up, that might be the place to solve them, at least to clarify what's in control of this group. From there, once we know that, then we could manage the things that are in our remit and try to cooperate with the things that aren't ours to deal with. I mean, for example, there's the process for changes to naming systems and void descriptions, which we do have a process, but the process is somewhat broken because we don't ever finish the process, right? We have a process for submitting changes, but we don't have a real process for getting them approved and then enacting them. And things have stalled on a couple of the requests that I've seen come across the fora. Is it fora for plural? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Technically, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's just a very narrow, simple example of the process. But in terms of things like making decisions around the Canadian URI registry, it's been clear that that's not the baseline group's concern. But we've raised items for decision from this group. I just don't know where they go. That's sort of one of the examples of the kinds of things you're talking about in terms of clarifying the governance of things.
Okay. No, this is great. This is helpful because I'm able to attach these to some of this feedback to these items. I think for when they can be prioritized as agenda items for some of the upcoming calls, I can relay this context as well to help sort of jumpstart those discussions. Okay. Any other thoughts from the group? Just I know this is kind of a broad way to cap it off, but yeah, just in terms of other items and potential topics, anything anything additional to share?
The review of the Pan-Canadian Health Data Content Framework is closing next week. Well, May 6th, I think. So if you haven't heard about it, haven't looked at it, want to take a look at it and make any comments, we would really appreciate it.
Shouldn't that have gone to review before the IG that actually implements it went to review?
Yeah, Infoway was basically kind of doing like a preliminary of it. And then that'll be iterated as the underlying data content iterates, is my
Okay.
understanding.
But I agree with you, Elliot. It did feel like cart before the horse a little bit, except that some of the stuff we really need to get out because people are trying to build on it. So
So I've got that down as well. Yeah, I'll do just like a last check. Any other topics or anything just in our last 5 minutes anyone wants to raise? Okay. Well, hearing none, I think with a few minutes left, happy to give a bit of time back. Really appreciate the feedback and the discussion on the topics, and as well just the further feedback on how we can bring some of those different topics up to the surface for the upcoming call in 2 weeks, and then I'll continue to document for some of those other considerations, like the call 2 calls from now, just to make folks aware. But yeah, just really appreciate everyone's input. Good to hear from folks after some time away, and yeah, just wishing everyone a great weekend.
And congrats again, Mike.
Thank you.
That's a big accomplishment.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks and congrats.
Okay. Take care, folks.
Thank you.